And thank you everyone for having me here. And I will read up the title. It's called Theorical Contention. It sounds a bit awkward, but I think what I will do will be more of looking philosophy of history narrowly construed a bit from the outside, or from a larger point of view, or from the viewpoint of a larger field, of which I think is going on in a phase of reorganization lately, and I call let's say the ongoing reorganization of the field, whatever this field means, is actually one of the main issues which are being discussed today. And I think João will have a more Cambridge elements on sort of defining this field, the theory and philosophy of history, or reviewing the different definitions of the field and what sort of research this field entails. But I just collected a couple of points, but I think more or less capture what's going on lately within this field that I leave unnamed for the time being. But I think there is one thing that's currently, or since a while, it's already visible, is the exhaustion of narrativism as the dominant framework to structure research in the theory and philosophy of history. And of course, it doesn't mean that narrativism fades out. It means that its dominance to structure research is what's more or less phasing out. And then the second thing is that the simultaneous emergence of new challenges which arise out of our experiential horizon. And again, the point is that whenever you are doing sort of theoretical philosophical research, then of course you are responding to whatever is available in your experiential horizon. And I think that lately this boils down to a couple of interrelated challenges in the sociopolitical domain, the Anthropocene related discourses and discussions and challenges, and in technoscientific discussions ranging from human enhancement to advanced nanotechnologies and of course, visions of technological singularity and so on. Now, when these things boil down to research in the theory and philosophy of history, then the standard distinctions which used to structure the field do not apply. Or I think that you cannot really capture the character of work done on these new challenges by invoking the standard distinctions of the fields which used to structure research. Of course, it's the analytical versus substantive and critical versus speculative philosophies of history. And yes, as I said, I think that they cannot capture the character of theoretical work in the 21st century that emerged in the space that opened up by seeking new responses to new challenges. And I will constantly point to stuff which where I'm talking about these a bit more in more details. And this is actually, it was a small article, Do Theories of History Have a Theory of History? Which then came out also in Portuguese as a part of, or the first instance of a small ebook series. And then here I just put on a lot of books which came out in the last decades. And these are instances, just to see how many these are, that you cannot adequately capture by having these analytic versus substantive philosophy of history distinctions. So much of these were going on in historical time scholarship, much of this were going on historical injustice, much of the work going on in media and communication studies, which filter through popular engagements of the past and so on. None of these can be adequately described by these distinctions. And I think that what actually, or the best phrase, I mean, hence the notion of the new historical condition, or the phrase the new historical condition, but because I think that the work of 21st century theories and philosophies of history is best described as theoretical explorations of an emerging new historical condition of the world and ourselves. And with Marek Tam, we try to sort of venture into this exploration And then we singled out 5 of its constituents, but of course it's just what we think are one of the most prominent ones, but it doesn't mean it's not a definite list. But I think that what is going on in these challenges that constitute our experiential horizon is the emergence of new kind of futures, the exploration of which, or for the explanation of which we sort of kicked off the Historical Futures project jointly with the journal History and Theory. And okay, just a few words on that. So what we mean by historical futures is any sort of transitional relations from apprehended past to anticipated futures. There are many, many ways in which many conceptions of change over time that leads from apprehended pasts to anticipated futures. The historical processual developmental way is only one of them. And I think that today, especially in certain technoscientific imaginaries, and also in Earth system science about, transitions of the Earth, when we think of as a whole system integrated, consists with integrated subsystems, that sort of transitions are not the way that we think when we talk about historical trajectories, or what we have been talking about as developmental historical trajectories in the last 200 years or so. So we have these new kind of futures which we think disconnect apprehended paths and futures. And this is the one. This is one thing which we think is integral to this emerging new historical conditions that we are yet to explore, or we are trying to explore. The second is the ongoing redefinition of the human, which is really going on everywhere these days. So I'm not going to go very deeply into this, but of course the Anthropocene, who is the Anthropos, big discussions, again, technoscientific imaginaries, human enhancement, transhumanism, and so on. The third is, with all these things, of course, comes a sort of a new way of, or new modes of universalist thinking that which needs to be situated with challenges in a much more differentiated sociopolitical domain. And as to the redefinition of the human, with Marek, we also organize a special issue on historical thinking and the human in the Journal of the Philosophy of History. With this new universalism we are still working on, so do we work still on a shift to a digital historicity. But in the volume that was already mentioned a few times by now, that you only edited on philosophy of history, we also had a joint chapter with Marek in which we try to explain how all this boils down to a new notion of history, a new notion of modern human history. And now, the main question, I think this was one of the biggest questions for the call for this conference, that what is the role of philosophy of history, a bit more narrowly construed today. And I think that because the field has emerged out of this distinction between analytical and substantive and critical and speculative philosophies of history, which has also been rebranded into a new distinction between philosophy of history and philosophy of historiography, that also Jouni is using in post-narrativist philosophy of historiography, and Avitaker is using it, and even Herman Paul is using it in his call for an integrated history and philosophy of history, in which history, also Herman Paul says, best defined, at least in the first step, or confined to a philosophy of historiography. But again, if you keep being confined on that, or if philosophy of history narrowly construed keeps on being confined to that, then there is a large extent to which it fails to connect these bigger challenges which comprise our experiential horizon these days. So philosophy of history, I think as of now, and also the 3 previous talks were focusing on philosophy of historiography. But what potentially can happen, I think, is much more interesting. And I think there is already, let's say, signs or tendencies towards that, because I think that there is a growing recognition that history is not merely a matter of historiography as professionalized historical writing. And there are a couple of notions which already sort of structure theoretical philosophical research on history, history culture or historical culture, historicity, historical sensibility. I also use that sometimes, relations to the past, present, future, and so on. So there are a lot of notions in currency which point beyond philosophy of historiography. And of course, what research structured by these notions aim at is to study the different historical apprehensions of the world, of which historiography is one. And the point, of course, is to see them in relation to each other. And I think that philosophy of history may establish an approach within this larger field, and there are several ways to do it, which I'm not going to go into because I cannot foresee the future, but definitely there is a lot of ways open to link to this larger research. But I think that what philosophy of history as we know it, or philosophy of historiography as we know it, cannot spare is to see itself relationally within this much larger endeavor. And again, there's no time to go into how to all the many things to which philosophy of history can see itself relationally, but one of the most important is its object of study, of course, which is historical studies. And I think that philosophy of history, as philosophy of historiography, philosophy of history as we know it today, had a certain relation to historical studies, which just wasn't the most appealing to historians. Because philosophy of history, together with much of narrativist research and with a lot of postmodern theories of history, to historians, it boiled down that these theories and philosophies are sort of, as I say, uninvited besserwisser, you know, the uninvited know-it-all, who tells you what to do and claims to even know it better than historians. So due to this, I think you had a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of debates in which, you know, historians and philosophers were talking past to each other and that actually failed to meaningfully engage. And the role philosophy of history played in these not very often happening debates actually between historians and philosophers was that philosophy of history played the oftentimes bad conscience of historiography's disciplinary self-understanding. But in case philosophy of history opens up to those larger challenges that comprise our contemporary moment, then I think that that there are certain sort of benefits to it also for philosophy of history, and I think that it might not necessarily entail losing track of much of the things that has been done, of course, within the field. So in that sense, of course, the field or the philosophy of history narrowly construed can still hold on its agenda to provide a sort of self-understanding of historical studies, but it becomes only one of the aims within the larger field. And of course, it means not by studying only historiography, but by seeing historiography within this larger set of historical practices in a relational matrix. And of course, that will rewire the relationship to historical studies as well, because also the main imperative, of course, would not be to develop an understanding of professionalized academic historical studies, but to explore the larger set of historical practices, of which historical studies is one. And of course, that would also entail a very, very different self-understanding for the discipline as well. And I think this also requires, you know, a lot of joint work in people from different disciplines and across approaches. And I think it also implies that historical knowledge formations, I mean, historical studies, and all the different studies, philosophy of history, which studies it will also probably are not going to kept intact. And this leads to my final point. which I addressed more closely in this book, The Ethical Event Transformations in the Entangled Human, Technological, and Natural Worlds, is the question of disciplinarity. Because I think that these challenges that I was talking about, or as I phrased it in the slide, that our current crisis consists of the collision of human and natural worlds through advanced technologies. But then the problem is that no knowledge formations, and I mean knowledge formations of modernity, which is a disciplinary knowledge regime. And in the disciplinary knowledge regime, no discipline was designed to address these questions, to see these challenges together, the human and the natural worlds, and the way that they collapse through advanced technologies. No disciplines were designed to study that. I mean, if you consider that, let's say, geology, biology, and history has been institutionalized more or less in the same time, late 18th, early 19th century. And they were tests like a distribution of work. All are historical sciences, but they have been tasked to study their own object of study separately. So you had a sort of an Earth history written by geology. You had the history of life on Earth, which is biology, and you had history, which is a history of a certain life form on Earth, which is, human societies. And all these were institutionalized at the same time, but they studied their objects separately. And now, when there is again a growing recognition that these challenges hang together, there is no discipline in currency which is able to address the whole thing as one. The disciplines are able to address constituents seen not in relation to each other, but separately. So I think that this also means, of course, that whatever we think about historical studies, whatever we think about philosophy of history, if it wants to explore, this emerging new historical condition, which entails seeing these challenges together as one, then of course it needs to step beyond disciplinarity in order to be able to see what is the challenge in the first place. And of course, as an initial step, it demands the collision of existing knowledge formations, which I think is what is happening now. But in the long run, it will likely result in the development of the new knowledge regime, in which just new knowledges arise to address a new object of study in the first place. So, and the study of a new historical condition, I think, takes place within these transdisciplinary discussions. But the question of how integral such a study, or for that matter, how integral any sort of historical thinking would be to a knowledge regime beyond disciplinarity, and what shape all this would take, that's, I think, depends on us now or in the next couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for sticking to time so well as well. We have 10 minutes at least for questions now and discussions. So please, Madam Mr.
I don't really know what you mean when they say historical condition. So could you tell me I didn't really get a sense of what the new historical condition might be, or how you would characterize it, or what it is for there to be a new historical condition. Can you just fill that in for me, please?
Yeah. It's in a way, conceiving your life words, conceiving yourself historically means, or it has meant in the last, let's say, 2 decades or so, to see yourself and see every single occurrence as being part of being integrated into larger processes and developments unfolding over time, right? You never see anything in its insularity. Thinking historically in the modern world has meant to integrate these things into these larger developmental processes. But now, what I'm trying to say that what happens in technological imaginaries, what happens in Earth system science is that the way that these transitions, from past to future states is configured is different, it's not processual, it's not developmental, it's not historical as we know it in the modern world. It is still historical to the extent that there is a transition from an altered state, but it's not processual and not developmental. And then this is just one part of the whole picture, but to get to the question, so historical condition would mean more or less the same as in integrating, singular occurrences in larger trajectories, which is a sort of a worldview or, a mental, projection onto the world. It's just, a different grid, a different way to see whatever is going on in the world and a different way of conceive of yourself. Still historically, because it entails change over time, but different way than it has been before. Does it make sense?
We can come back to this. I think some of the other questions will lead to that as well. We've got 5 people waiting now. Is the next one?
There's one online that fits very well to that on the historical condition as well. So maybe we can ask that one. And it's, let me just get the name. It's from Knife Albeit. I hope I've said that correctly. And the question is, what is the role that the past works of speculative philosophy of history, such as Toynbee, Hegel, and Spengler, would play in this new historical condition? Or should we move beyond such works in your judgment?
Yeah, I would say not much. Yeah, that's right. I mean, of course, Hegel told me these are the classical philosophies of history worked on the premise of seeing or conceiving of change over time in this process of developmental manner. I mean, now I think what we need to understand is what happens, or we actually need to, first way, I think, to conceptualize change over time differently than what is used to be called historical, which is the process of developmental way of change over time. And I think that these classical philosophies of history, of course, has a very, very bad reputation today, and much of humanities and social scientific research is devoted to trying to overcome teleology, directionality, blah, 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 all these things. And of course, there are very sophisticated theoretical constructions which intend to do this work. But at the same time, what I'm trying to say is that you don't need to do these theoretical constructions. It is already, change over time is already conceived of differently outside official philosophies of history, be they these old classical philosophies of history, or be they philosophies of historiography. So it's more like to explore what is already going on, how change over time is already conceived of in practices outside historiography and outside also classical philosophies of history, and to see this in relation to historical studies as well.
Yeah, and I'm anticipating you'll get more questions in that line. Jonas, why don't you go next?
Great, thanks. Yes, very interesting. I was thinking about what you said about disciplinary boundaries, and as I understood your argument, you were saying that we need some sort of creation of a new discipline that can tackle the sort of a tangled situation.
Not a discipline, that's the point.
Oh, okay, but
knowledge formation, which is
a knowledge formation. Yeah, okay, but
more knowledge formation.
But one thing I'm thinking about here is that one point about having different disciplines is that they also rest on a recognition about qualitative differences between the kinds of questions one asks within different disciplines. So, and I'm also thinking about here, for example, then exploring our present condition. We can ask very different kinds of questions about this. For instance, different kinds of why questions. I could say, for instance, why is Finland no longer covered with ice all year round? And why is Finland no longer part of Russia? Now, these are qualitatively different kinds of questions. So what I'm wondering about this, isn't there a risk of not doing justice to these kinds of qualitative differences if one thinks that, well, we need a knowledge formation that doesn't have any disciplinary boundaries, that can equally tackle questions about why Finland is no longer covered with ice all year round, and why we have a stable democracy, or why we are no longer part of Russia. So.
Well, I think that having new knowledge formation doesn't mean that whatever was an old knowledge formation needs to disappear. This is not what happens. There is actually currently, there are at least two different knowledge regimes, even at universities, being institutionalized. One is the disciplinary kind of approaching things, and the other one is the studies. The studies 30, 40 years ago already cut through the disciplinary distribution of knowledge, because they are not organized by virtue of being this and that approach. They are organized by virtue of the object they study. So you have gender studies, they have post-colonial studies, but if you are at the gender studies department, you can be a historian, you can be a philosopher, you can be, any of the previously existing disciplines within the disciplinary knowledge regime. And again, just because new knowledge formations has arisen, it didn't make other ones vanish. So but I'm not saying that now everybody needs to do this. I'm saying that in order to understand and in order to respond to whatever is going on in our world, and not simply to work on the questions that 3 generations ago certain people asked, then we need to develop or move towards, sort of new knowledge formations, which are tailored to our own questions.
We have 3 more questions in line, and I'm going to ask everyone to be brief. One's online, then Joni, Matti, then Tullio.
Should we take them all together and leave?
No, let's just go quickly.
Okay. This question is by Josepina Doro again. And she said, can you explain the concept of the historical future? Can there be a historical future if there's no historical past distinct, conceptually, not ontologically distinct from the natural past? I guess it's 2 questions. What is the historical futures, and can there be historical futures if there's no historical past that's distinct from a natural past?
Well, historical futures is an analytical category. It is, I actually defined it in the talk. It's, transitional relations between apprehended past and anticipated futures. It is the transition from past to futures. And it's what makes it historical is, of course, the transitional character, because it entails the change over time, and that which we do not call, or that which we call ahistorical, is that which doesn't change over time. So historical futures as an analytical category, we coined the analytical category in order to enable us to investigate these many different transitional or many modes or modalities, actually, of these transitions from apprehended past to anticipated futures. And it can be, of course, this can happen as we used to think about it, as a development over time. Past potential unfolds over the course of history, comes to the fulfillment, blah, blah, blah. It can also happen in, and that's, again, that will be, of course, my personal research interest. It can happen, especially in technoscientific imaginaries, in a sort of evental manner in which there is a big game changer event that lands you in a totally new reality, which is a technological singularity. Because once it happens, you just cannot see beyond that point. When greater than human intelligence is being created, it is expected to result in an intelligence explosion in which greater and greater human intelligences are created by greater and greater human intelligence. But of course, you cannot even conceive of it with your limited human cognitive capacities. So hence the notion of the technological singularity, a sort of point of no return beyond which a new reality opens up. We have zero idea what's going on afterwards, right? But it is a historical transition. It is a historical future. And we cannot even, if we try to project this, developmental process or scenario we associated with history, we even fail to understand it in the first place. And then in the human and social sciences, we are going to produce nonsense about it because we just bring it down to what we think was, I don't know, 100 years ago mental scheme. And this is why we sort of, the idea behind the novelty futures is to enable research in different sort of transitions to anticipated futures.
You want to tackle the second part quickly, or
Second part.
the second question?
Oh, at the time it was,
What was that?
Distinct, yeah.
you can see it.
Not controversial, distinct from the past.
We only.
But, yeah, I think
So if you can just,
I think I implied an answer.
I wasn't sure. Was answered there?
Yeah, there is a distinction between past.
All right, thanks. Joni, Matti, Tullio, do you feel urgency to ask a question?
I can drop.
Yeah, it's better, I think, if we move on. So Tullio, you'd be next if you want to set up. Thank you, Zoltán, again.